Good evening. My name is Dominique Johnson, and I'm the current Senior Advisor of Community and External Engagement for the Center for Policing Equity. Tonight, I welcome you to a forum between leaders of the Charlottesville Police Department and the Center for Policing Equity to discuss the need to use science to change public safety. As many of you know, August marks the 4th anniversary of the Unite the Right rally, and it is more important than ever that police departments and communities come together to redesign public safety and create equitable communities for everyone. CPE has recently completed its data gap analysis for CPD, which shows that we will be able to do some analysis related to use of force, and we outline how CPD can further improve its data collection practices. Tonight, I am joined by the lovely Dr. Tracy Elkassi, and she is the Senior Vice President of the Justice Initiatives portfolio for CPE and the co-founder of the Center for Policing Equity. And I'm also joined by Chief Brackney. So as you all know, Chief Brackney is, prior to her appointment, she was a chief in, prior to Chief Brackney's appointment as the Chief of Police in Charlottesville, Virginia. Dr. Brackney retired after 30 years with the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police. Additionally, she served as the Chief of Police for George Washington University. She is a recognized expert in the areas of harm reduction, procedural and restorative justice practices, and community relations. Tonight, I'm going to give them both a chance to really showcase and talk to you about the work that they're doing currently as co-founder of CPE and as current Chief of Police in Charlottesville. We're going to start with asking some questions here, and I hope to keep it as conversational as possible, but I'm also going to invite you all to give me questions in the chat. So bear with me though, because being in the chat and also asking these questions is a little tricky. So I want to keep it cool, calm, and collected. And I'm going to start by asking you, Chief Brackney, what brings you to this work and why you stay in it? And why did you partner with CPE?
So thanks, Dominique. Thank you. And yeah, just like the opportunity. So what brings me to this work? I think most of us have always thought about being in spaces that we didn't have access to before. And what does that look like on the inside? And for me, that's been policing and public safety, and that kinds of work to me has always been important growing up in the communities in which a police presence didn't feel the same as I, grew older and could see it being done differently. Like I could see it very differently in a real way of what policing could be and what it was in certain communities and with certain individuals. And that's actually why I stay here, because there hasn't been this equitable approach to the way that we do policing. And it's not been a just way in which we do it. So that's work has been important to me for decades. But why CPE? So this is kind of an inside story, right? So in July of 2018, I email Dr. Goff and say, hey, I've been a fan of your work for years. I know David Harris, who sits on your board. We were friends back in Pittsburgh. He's a professor at University of Pittsburgh. And I'd like to partner. But then, not necessarily hearing anything from him to start because he's so busy, I then hit him up with, hey, by the way, you're friends with my husband. And if that doesn't get me at least an intro, I'm going to have to start calling some of those Southern Mississippi roots kinds of get your mama involved, because we need to have you really look at our police department. And CPE is the gold standard in doing this in an objective, systematic way approach to really taking an introspective look at a police department around its patterns or its practices of force or, investigative detentions, arrests, data and charging data. And I wanted to really know what this organization looked like from the inside out.
Absolutely. So I'm going to bring you in, Tracy. Mostly because I gave you a brief introduction, and what y'all don't know is that Tracy is my supervisor, my direct supervisor. So this is the first time that I'm doing something with my direct supervisor. So she's probably looking at me like, get it together. So first of all, I want to just say that Tracy has been an inspiration to me as a retired 25-year veteran of the Denver Police Department. And she holds so many degrees. So I'm going to say a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. She has a Public Policy and Administration certification. She has a PhD. She's a graduate of the 203rd class of the FBI National Academy in Quantico, which I actually had a chance to go and visit. So you've published articles, you've collected a variety of experiences and reviewed scientific journals, and you come to work every day at CPE. I want to just talk to you about why do you come to work at CPE every day? What made you sort of start the Center for Policing Equity with Dr. Phil Goff, and why do you come to work every day and supervise me? No, but why do you come to work every day and hold partnerships with wonderful police departments like CPD?
Thank you. And please, so we're doing this because the chief just put our business out in the street. So let me back up just a little bit. And thank you, Dominique. You're doing just fine. Please don't allow that to cloud that. So let me back up a little bit, because the chief sort of, again, is saying, throwing the business out there, and we're doing this, right? So we're going to do it this way. So I was, as you mentioned, with the Denver Police Department, retired from there, and then went on to NYPD to be their Deputy Commissioner of Training and Equity and Inclusion. But during my work at Denver PD, and as a commander in a district or a precinct, for those of the folks that are still on the street, you know that you answer to a lot of folks. And so I had been at a community meeting where just a few years prior to my arrival, we had a young Black male with mental health issues that was shot and killed by a Denver police officer. He was known to the officer. And so the questions were still not being answered to the satisfaction of the community. And as the commander, I was being asked, is this what you train your officers to do? That you don't, you want relationships on one hand, and the other hand, this is how our relationships turn out. And that was a hard question, especially as a woman of color. It was very difficult for me. And so I met Phil at Stanford. We were there on behalf of Jennifer Eberhardt, who was doing the work around implicit bias, race, and policing. And it was during that time that my conversations with Phil really turned into a challenge around doing this work in a legit way. So you may or may not know, but most folks know that when researchers do any kind of research, they usually use students because they're free, or you can buy them with food. And so for me, that wasn't enough. If you're going to do this work and you want to say you have an impact on policing, you need to be in the space where the work really truly gets done. And so he took that challenge. And so 13 years ago, CPE was put together in collaboration and out of thought for that. And as we were doing that work, really the theory of change for us was really about how do you most effectively address race? Because it continues to be an issue in policing, continues to impact the outcomes of those that are most vulnerable. And one of the ways that we really think and that we do address that is through changing situations. A lot of folks would want to say, well, it's the hearts and minds. And I think most of us know we were all raised some kind of way. We were raised to believe things. And it's difficult to try to undo those things that are very salient to you. Whether you're told by your mother, your church, by friends, those things are very difficult to impact. But when you can change the situation, and you can do that with the use of science on how to direct you, it becomes something that's very doable. And so that is, one of the reasons why many other than, of our own communities, but one of the reasons why we are so into the science, into the data, and that we know evidence-based work and the data can help drive those difficult decisions. And I know the chief, you're having the same issues that we're trying to figure out, how do you do this? And at the same time, how do you change culture?
Yeah, I want to ask that, because as someone who works in communities all across the country with CPE, the common consensus is I already know these things as a Black person. I'm seeing this not only on the news, but from my lived experiences where I am in the neighborhoods, and it's not sort of going away. And my question to you, Chief Brackney, is how do you envision utilizing data to make those changes? And how do you work with communities at large to do that, but also work within your department, as Tracy said, to change the culture to move those relationships forward and to provide sort of some relief to the Black death that we're seeing on TV every day.
So what's so important about data and the way you go about collecting data, and the type of data you collect, the way you organize the data will all tell you a very different picture about what it is that you're looking at, right? And we don't need reports to tell us what we may inherently know or that are our lived experiences. But in order to move systems, we don't value those lived experience in Western society. Whereas those storytelling in other cultures has the ability to influence. And often Western culture, the only thing that we will believe, and again, that's even controversial right now, is data in science. And typically, we've not collected data in a way that validates or even authenticates or gives value to those voices of lived experiences, right? So the way CPE has asked us to collect our data and to turn that over will then allow us to see in a very real way a story that we may not have been able to weave together if it was just one person telling us. We can't capture those lived experiences, but we can capture that data because we've been going about this for years. And we're not just collecting 1 year of data. We're looking at 6, 7, 8 years of data as far back as we could go. Most people like a 10-year span, but we had some challenges around data so that we could say, are we doing things in a fair, impartial way in which we go about the work of policing, either through policy or practice? And is there a disconnect between what our data is saying to us and what people say? I don't need your data to tell me, right? I know that I'm 4 or 5 times more likely to be stopped by a police officer if I'm an African-American male, or I'm 5 times more likely to be arrested, or the victim of police violence and brutality, just based on the color of my skin. And there's nothing that your data is going to be able to say or not say that tells me otherwise. So the reason the relationship is so important is having an objective lens, a standardized way in which we go about the work of collecting even data and reporting it out. And prior to my arrival, we didn't even collect ethnicity here. It was just Black or white or other. That was it. How do you tell the story? I mean, the real story of what we're doing here if we don't have data, science that says it, valid data in which you have a researcher, an entire research institution. I mean, I think that's important to say that the Center for Policing Equity is housed within a university. So it does also have that, rigor that's associated with it when they're doing the work that they do of looking through, mining, and pulling out our data. So I don't think we need the stories to tell the data story, but we need the data to bring value to those actual stories and lived experiences and bring life to the impact of what happens when you have data that's representative and accurate of how you're actually doing your operational work every day.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to get Tracy, you in here to talk a little bit about how do you strike that right balance between moving forward with the change and waiting to work with the data? Because I know that the chief talks about the importance of it and communities understand the importance of it and we're moving forward. But in your line of work, like how do you explain that with the 5 audiences that CPE serves, policymakers, law enforcement agencies, communities, science and researchers, and our donors? Like, how do you move that forward?
So there is a balance that you have to strike, because I think the first thing we have to acknowledge and to lift up is Black and Brown communities are exhausted. And so there is amount of exhaustion that is tired of someone believing or understanding the lived experience. So we have to be real and lift that up. But what the data allows you to do is when the community, if you center the community in this work and you allow them to lead you in this work, be able to ask and answer questions that they have, In some cases, I think the chief is right to validate some of the lived experiences, but most of the reports that we release, most Black and brown communities will tell you, yeah, so you knew that, right? So tell me something new, do something different than what I need to have done. But it's important because it does help tell part of the story. And we're still living in a country where people still don't believe what's happening here, that there is not a different experience, that there is not a different outcome. And that is different from intentionality, right? Because I think what you'll hear also cops say is like, I don't come to work doing that. I don't, that's not the first thing on my mind. And that might be the case for some, most, but not necessarily all. So let's be real about that. And the other part of this too is, in order to understand your data, you have to understand what the limitations of your data are, right? So the data gap analysis we did helps do exactly that. Communities asking questions, you can't answer it because you don't collect ethnicity. You don't collect that information. And we also have to be real in the fact that it does allow for accountability. It increases that. So as soon as you start collecting those things and you understand how they're operating or how they're showing up and how they're influencing policy, it allows you to make those changes. For some, that's not comfortable. Folks don't want to be pressed in that way. And we also have to make sure that we decenter ourselves from this, because a lot of times it feels like a personal attack. That's not what's happening here. And the data helps with that. The data says these things are happening. It allows chiefs to look at it and say, okay, let's go back and pull the policy. Let's make the policy change and then begin to collect the data again and see if we can do something different. But it does help in regards to, just understanding what's going on. It also helps you understand where trauma is being more impacted with other groups of folks, so you can disrupt that. Chief earlier mentioned about reducing harm. Part of this is really built into that. How do you begin to reduce that harm and eliminate overburdensome practices that are disproportionate in Black and brown communities? So there's a lot of that work that's going on. But there's a variety of sort of evidence-based changes that can happen now. But it's a balancing of those things. And officers also have to understand, what's the purpose of the data, right? Why are we doing this? How do you educate the organization around it and hold the organization accountable to it? Because a lot of that resistance you'll get passive resistance folks who don't want to do it and will call it something else or name it something else and deflect from it. That's real. It's real. And it's one in which chiefs have to deal with every day. And when it becomes the data is, leading and driving, and it's, helping the community make better decisions and asks, folks feel some kind of way about that. And you have to be real, and you have to be able to understand what is the change management of understanding what data can do in helping you change the culture.
So I have a question for you then, after you've given us all that information. Do you find that your time in the police department was more difficult than it is now, being on the outside and helping departments like CPD, or is it sort of similar in that way of change management?
It's a great question. It's a combination of both. This work is hard. I don't, if anybody's telling you we can do this in 90 days and you'll be fine, we're talking about human lives. We're talking about the community, and we're talking about law enforcement, and it's difficult. And I was doing this work when I was in uniform. So prior to my retirement, I was doing this work, and even doing it internally was difficult. And especially what I visually represent is difficult for some folks. But I think what you have to really think about is, who are you doing the work for? And so for me, the work is not only for the community, Black and brown communities, but for the officers. The officers no longer want to be in spaces where they should not be. We hear this daily in all of the work that we're doing across the country. There are calls that they should not be showing up to, which tells us other systems are failing. And that means folks in charge of those other pieces need to also be brought to the table to begin to deal with those issues. It's hard work, period, because you're dealing with real humans, live emotions, historical issues, current issues, and you have to be careful how you step through those, because you do not want to re-traumatize folks, but you want to be honest about what can and cannot be done. And you also need to make sure that you are being transparent along the way. And for some folks, it's very hard. It's a very hard thing to accept when you're hearing it, and it may be something you don't want to hear.
Yeah, that's true. Chief, I want to be able to ask you as well, because I didn't give your story career. I did ask both of you guys for 1 to 2 sentences, and you gave me this whole whole huge bio. So I'm not going to get into that and judge you guys. But what I am going to ask you, Chief, is how do you then do all this work internally as you are thinking about lived experiences and perspectives from both sides of sort of the coin toss, and as being a woman and being a woman of color, and navigating sort of your external representation of community representation, as well as internally as an officer, as someone who has come up through the ranks and made it to such a high position? Where do you find the balance in doing that?
You know what? So as Tracy said, this is hard work. If anyone thinks this is like the easy life, that once you get to the chief, you get to just get the sign on the door, and everybody calls you chief, and then your life just starts becoming easy breezy or whatever it is. That is so not it. Especially if you represent so many different things to so many different people, right? And then you try and balance and shift that burden every single day to see which one of those hats that you're wearing is the one that at least can be able to hold up that burden for the day, right? To shoulder that burden for that moment. And it is really difficult, particularly Tracy said something really interesting about how do you decenter yourself from this? Like, how do you pull yourself out of this so that you don't become the lightning rod for the issues you're trying to address? And so that things don't get deflected in a way, right? So if I'm looking at how do we use data to change our policies, our practices, and how do we reckon with and rectify some of the harms that we've done based on institutional policies of how we police and the patterns in which we police, like the districts and the way we police, the number of officers we have in certain communities and other ones will influence all of our data. And that's really interesting to me. And it becomes often this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? When we say things about data, that certain areas are high crime area, certain areas, there are more arrests. Well, when you flood communities with officers in a particular area, the likelihood that they're engaging people that are involved in criminal activity is because there's that frequency there. We are there all the time. If you're not in an area where those same crimes might be occurring, you're less likely to see that thing going on. And that then skews your data, right? Especially around these predictive policing models about where crime is occurring and how we're responding to it. For me, the most challenging part about all of this is how do we think about collecting data as a tool for accountability and transparency in the agency, right? That says a community is demanding this of us, and that we don't close off in such a way that we continue to reinforce this us versus them mentality, which we've been saying we're trying to get away from now since 21st century policing, community policing, and all those other ones. And then how do you balance that with, as Tracy says, what do I visually represent within this agency and within the community? And that's really hard work. Within this agency, I am the only African-American female in this agency. So as I walk through this agency, I am always representing that community and taking on that burden of what that might represent. And how do I get a message across to people who may not speak the same language that I speak? And what I mean by that is the language around what does procedural justice in policing look like? What does restorative justice in policing look like? What is harm reduction? And then not have that narrative twisted to say, well, you're worried about excessive force with policing. What about Black on Black crime, right? Isn't that the real issue? Isn't that really what the problem is? And then you have to try and balance that we have systems of power that we have to be accountable to the community for. We have given it an awesome amount of power. And we have to use our data to say, are we using that in a just, fair, and equitable way? And oftentimes when people or when CPE comes in, or where you're asking for some other organization to come in and look at that, you quickly find that we are not using our power in a just way. We're using it in a familiar way, in an institutional way. and a way in which the, policing has been indoctrinated to think about using its power in places and spaces, as Tracy said, where we shouldn't be at all. And then we find ourselves very conflicted about the roles and responsibilities that we have within the organization and who we are as individuals. And it's very hard to separate the two of those, particularly for me.
So if I could, just really quickly,
Yeah.
if you wouldn't mind, Dominique, because what you just said is, it sort of made me feel some kind of way. There's a couple things, and it's one of the reasons why CPE doesn't charge for the work, because of that. Because if we did, then we would be put into the middle of saying, you're doing this because we're paying you to do this, right? And this is one of the reasons why we don't charge for the work, because of this, because the data has to be able to stand. And if it can't, then you have to do what's necessary to get those answers through the data. And sometimes it's very difficult to do that. And in some cases, it means you may have to collect more. And collecting more, and I remember, I can feel it now when, the chief used to say, well, now we're doing traffic stop data collection. And it's just like, really, when am I supposed to do that? Right. And so that's real. And you have to be able to answer to that and why. And so I think that for me, when you said that, I was just thinking, it was a flashback. It was like, oh my God. Yeah. So we all had to go through this, where we had to do something. And a lot of times didn't understand why, because it wasn't never sort of explained to us and walked through of why it's important, not just for us as an organization, but for the community. But yeah, no, I just wanted to, because when you said that, I was like, okay.
That's what it made. So you kind of took my question though, because I was going to ask. No, I was going to actually ask about the piece of, you had mentioned earlier, Chief Brackney, around collecting for ethnicity. And so for me, what was the impetus for that? And why wasn't it being collected for earlier? And then is that something that when you bring to the work, you're coming to the work and saying, these are the things that I want to be able to expand upon to be able to reach these equitable outcomes for folks by being able to paint the scientific picture? So talk to me about that process.
So the full picture, right? And when Tracy said that pain point of collecting more data, that is something you'll hear from officers all the time. Why do we have to, document use of force and response to resistance? And we've got 8 or 9 or 10 pages or 10 different forms that we fill out. And then we've got the traffic stop form, and that same information is already on the ticket. And so why do we have to have it, right? And why do we have to document that we're the ones who initiated that encounter? Why do we have to do all these things? And I think sometimes that our real message doesn't penetrate all the way down through the organization in the way that we would like to do that. And the reason it was important for me to collect the data is when I first arrived here, there were a lot of questions about, investigative detentions, stop and frisk, and use of force. And when I looked at it, we weren't collecting any of that data. And I come from, my background is public policy, public management, those are the stuff that I do the research in. What do we do and how do we do it? And how do you create policies that you can then justly implement? Not just have a policy, how is it still justly and fairly implemented throughout the organization? And I didn't have a complete picture of anything. I mean, nothing. I don't know why it was collected. Sometimes it may be convenient systems. Sometimes it's pretty costly. Our records management system, they've evolved over the years, but these are really expensive software systems that you have to keep creating. So sometimes it may have just been cost effective not to collect the data. So I'm sure Tracy could give you a better answer as to when people start saying, this is painful, like this is a resource, a human resource. Somebody has to figure out how to mine that data, to extract the data, to import the data, to standardize the data so that the data sets, you're actually comparing the same things. I'm sure there's data that CPE got from us that they had to throw some out so that they could have complete sets of data across the years. And if they didn't have complete sets, that data point had to be removed from the data sets so that they really could give us a fuller picture of what we are doing and how we're doing it. Does that make sense, Dominique? And I think Tracy was going to just talk. Were you jumping in?
Yeah, and I was just going to, cosine and plus one to that you don't need it, but it is about the ability to have the data to answer the questions. And I think that's what folks are really forgetting. Historically, we had to just really done aggregate, groups of data to say whether or not crime was up or crime was down. And it really wasn't giving the full picture around what was going on. So it is that. And it's also to, and I have to think about it. I think about this through my career and even the work I do today. Cops just don't like science. Let's be clear, right? We are not big on science at all. And this is science. And the science does help us do our work. We're getting better. I know when I came on, there was, you brought a researcher in and it was over. Nobody's talking to that person. So we don't like science, but we also know that science in this day and age can help us and help us do our work in the way in which we should be doing it. And so I think that we've come a long way when it comes to when you talk about data and when you talk about evidence-based, when you talk about all of those things, but we still have large groups of folks who don't understand it. And some of that though, and I think of where I hear you, Chief, is how do you get that message and conversation pushed down to the ground? Because this is the same conversation we're having in regards to outcomes that we see throughout the country. So whether it is, Mr. Floyd, whether, whoever it is still the conversations of why that happened, why it had to happen, and why did it happen? And we're still having these conversations. And the data can help with some of those things, but you also have to react to the data. So it's not just collecting it. If it's telling you to do something or it's pointing you to do something, you should be doing it. You should be doing it. And I think that's the difference.
Right. And if we just add one more thing about when we say cops don't like data, let me tell you when they do like data, right? They don't mind if it's, not introspective. If it's retrospective and it's somewhere out and someone else, and we're using data for like crime trends, clearances, tickets, citations, we love data when we're using it as part of our, our resumes and promotional opportunities, how many traffic stops, arrests, or DUIs, and we love it then, right? But when we look at it and we somehow think that we now have to be responsible and responsive to our own data, then all of a sudden it becomes a very different conversation about the data and why is it relevant and why is it important. I think what we need to do is no longer become afraid of data. I say this all the time, that in football, they use, these films that say, here's how I played last week. Here's how I might play. Here's what my opponent looks like, as a Steelers fan, and I'm in this DC area, I'm not allowed to talk about the Redskins or Baltimore, but they use films very differently, right? And that's part of, you can see how you go about your work. Am I doing the job of a nose tackle well by looking at my films, by studying data, by studying statistics? We need to be able to transfer that same mentality to the work we do in policing, to say, here's the data, here's the science behind performance, and let's use it to improve that performance, that interaction, the way in which we go about policing communities.
And then, so as a chief, what is your role in that process? How do you make data sexy and appealing to folks who are not used to sort of collecting it in the way that will create the outcomes that we're hoping to see for communities? And it's not, I'm not going to say that it's intentional. It's just the way that the institution has been going. What's your role in that sort of humanization of the data to be able to get those equitable results?
So I think that's it for us. Being able to tell the story with some of the data and not make the story an outlier. Like this is just, an anomaly that this happened. This is not everyone's lived experience, right? And I think the way you push it down is talking about what benefits police officers, right? So, Tracy and I can tell you from our earliest training and now 37 years of policing, the way you push things down is say, how can it benefit officers, particularly around officer safety, right? As soon as you start talking officer safety, crime goes down, you have greater transparency, you have greater clearance rates, you have greater cooperation in the community. Once you talk to them about what the benefits are to them, and you really talk about it, not in some sort of PowerPoint way, but in a real, genuine, authentic way, I think they'll get it. Now, I'm not saying though everybody will buy into it. That's a very different narrative. I think they'll get it. Buying into it is a much harder sell. Remember, we've been doing the way we do policing in some form or another for the last 400 years, and we're still grappling with it today. Is what does policing mean? And what does that mean within different communities? So the data for us is going to be pushing it down to say, hey, this is how it benefits you. You have greater legitimacy in the community. There's greater transparency, which creates greater cooperation, and actually safer communities in which we all are part and responsible for the co-production of public safety. I think that's how you get the buy-in, but it does take a long time to deconstruct systems that have been in place for so long, and all you have is a moment. Like the average police chief is 3 years. 3 years. And why? Because it typically goes with the political cycle. Whoever the mayor is, or the governor is, or that person who appoints them every 4 years. So you've got a very short window to do a lot of work in a very short period of time. And as you know, a lot of chiefs are just leaving the profession in droves because of the demands, as Tracy said. We're not going to do this in some 90-day, give me your 100-day plan, and it's going to work. We can give you the 100-day plan of what we're going to need to do for the next 20 years.
Tracy, I see your head shaking, so I want to get your perspective on this too.
Yeah, and so let me back up a little bit. So it's not just how do you get them to understand and push it down, and it's about officer safety. That's a part of it. But the other part of this is really putting into, I think, a picturesque kind of way, is that we have a huge trust problem between police and Black and brown communities. And, most, not all, because there are some communities that usually are, not into that category. But when you can use data to help tell the story and help show that you can be held accountable, then it does help with this sort of relationship that you're trying to, for some, recreate and rebuild. But for a lot of folks to step back and just watch, because that's what most folks are going to do right now, right? So there's the say, we're going to use data to do this. Chief knows this, and they're going to watch. They're going to watch and see what you do. You have all this data. There's things you need to do. They're going to want to see how folks are going to be held accountable. What does it look different? And this is an opportunity as well for officers to be a part of it. Because oftentimes when you're doing data, and I find this too, there's been a while since we've been on the street, so we often have to go down and sit down with folks and sit down with people on the street. And you have to do that alignment as well, right? I know you may not be feeling it or seeing it, but here's what the data is saying. What are we missing? What needs to happen here? And really getting the voices in early to talk about that work. But again, it really is about how you make sure, because I think I want to just jump back a little bit, because one of the things I found that was interesting is that when we're trying to, push this down to officer safety, which is part of it, and it's historical, and that's sort of the cultural thing we already sort of go back to. This is about relationships as well, because your safety is tied up into some of those relationships. And so how we go about our day, how we think about our interactions, all of it is about those combinations of safety and the relationships. And so I think the community relationships are one that we have historically just not had to sit down and really think about. They have been transactional for the most part, that if we do something, we hope you like it. If not, oh well. And this really centering community and hearing community is very different. That means there are things, and this goes back to, I think, Chief, what you were saying, what is the role of police? What is the role? What should police officers be doing today? And those are the questions that cops are asking. What is it you want me to do or not do, and make it clear? And data is the part that helps with that. It just does. And it really does help you think about how you should be spending your day. And so I think as we move through, and Chief, I think as you start to do your work even more intently, we'll see that. We'll see the results of that. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What are the outcomes? What is the community saying? But for now, I always, I think back on these and I think, well, right now the community's just watching. There's just, there's been a lot of talk, been to a lot of meetings, Chief, a lot of community meetings. And there's enough talking. It's time for us to see what's really going to happen when you start to do these kind of initiatives and really look at the data.
Yeah, and Tracy and Dominique, we can just build one thing on there. I just put a quick note on here about data and what's so interesting and why it's so important. I post a lot of data on our website that we know. I mean, Tracy probably knows better than the rest of us that we know other departments are not doing. Like the stuff that we are doing is beyond innovative and transparent. But what we're also finding and why it's so important to have this relationship with CPE and that you're doing my data is some of the comments I've heard is, so before you got no data, like nothing was being posted anywhere. So there was not a lot of pushback that there was no data. Now that I'm posting all the data, the narrative is now, well, how do we know it's accurate or it's correct or it's not biased or it's not being presented in a way most favorable to, CPD. And that's why I'm so desperate always to keep these relationships with those people. Like when I say CPE, those people, I'm like, you all don't know. I mean, I don't think this community knows the type of conversations and the connections and how often there is something going back and forth with some aspect of CPE with our police department, because you then can say, listen, we looked at this. We can tell you the stuff that she's posting on her website, it is true. It is accurate. It is correct. Because people don't believe that now. So we've gone from no data to lots of data, no complaints to now the complaint is, are we sure that the data is accurate? So there's these narratives we're always going to have to fight unless we use CPE and the national databases that the mandates or the FBI databases for use of force, which is why it's so important to have these ways in which we collect data on a national standard. Because a small agency like myself, or actually we're considered a mid-sized agency, but we need to collect the data the same way Chicago does, the same way that LA does. And the uniform crime reporting is about the only way we kind of collect data the same way, but not those ways in which we go about our everyday business of doing policing in communities. And I think that's where CPE can help across the 18,000 policing agencies is how do we standardize a way in which we collect data, but it's expensive to do. It is expensive to do, and that's where you'll get the pushback often or most often.
It is, and it is that, right? It is the standardizing of the data across the country. So you think you're mid-size, right? So you go to major cities in IACP, you see the thousands of police departments. But the other part of this too is it's not just the standardizing data. I want to go back to something about the questions that are being asked. Well, how do we trust this, right? And that is inherent when you have mistrust in a relationship, right? So you may be trying to do the right thing, but because our historical mistrust has been deep and long, everything you may be trying to do correct is going to be questioned. So I think that, that is absolutely sounds right. But I think the other part of this, for us, for CPE, is the fact that it's not just what are you collecting, it's what's missing, right? And our ability to say, what's the missingness in your data? You can't answer questions when it's missing. And, and the other questions we push you all the time, is it intentional? Or, did you just not think of it? So really pushing you and your team to think about how do you do this? And how do you do this with community? Because those are the conversations that have to be had, right? And what is it they want to see? What is it they need to get or look at or have access to, right? Because democratizing data also means that other academics can do analysis around your data. It's not just CPE. It's like you take a look, and see what's going on. And we like that kind of relationship. So those are outside of just CPE, and we encourage that. When you're trying to, make sense of it, there's other folks that do specialty kinds of things you may want to ask. But I understand why community would question, right, whether the data was there. And again, that goes back to the reason why we just don't charge, because I like you and I go way back. I got no investment in that. It is what we do. But it is one of those things, though, that will be the hardest. And I think it's going to continue to be the hardest because it does give you an external facing picture and an internal facing picture as well. And those are the things that have to be reconciled.
Right. And Tracy, the humanity and all that, right? When you say decenter yourself, I'm thinking of it from my perspective, like, oh my goodness, I'm trying to give you everything I have. I'm trying to answer every question I think you don't know to ask me. Let's get it out there. Why don't you trust it? Right. That's the human individual in me. And I may trust, and I'm sure a lot of folks don't, I may trust Chief Brackney, but I don't trust the institution. So it doesn't matter what she puts on that site, the institution of policing, I don't trust it. And we've seen how data has been manipulated from the very beginning. Shout out to the work that my husband does on lynching and narratives, that the data, the narratives around what was happening led to why people were being lynched around crimes that were supposedly being committed by Black men, right? So I'm thinking you should be trusting me, but the more we talk, I'm trying to take my personal Rochelle, Black female from the, inner city community lens to say, someone's looking at this from a policing lens and not looking at it they're looking for the institution and not the individual.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess for me, before I want to open it up to questions, because I do have a lot of questions from community members, particularly about some of the incidences that have been happening here in Charlottesville. I do want to end this on a note of sort of the importance of data, the relationship with CPE and CPD, and just you all as Black women leading the work in this. What advice would you give to yourself at 17, at 21? Because I ask this because one of the questions I have is about school students. So this is not out of the wind, but I have some school students asking some questions in here, so I got to get it in. What advice would you give to someone who would be in that Gen Z millennial space as you all have been doing this work as Black women leaders on many different sides, actually?
So that's better than what I tell my 17-year-old self, which I would tell my 17-year-old self to keep doing because that eventually will pay off. It's interesting that the generational aspect of this is equally as important, right? And I would say to the Gen Zs, keep asking the questions, keep pushing it. I think sometimes some of this is just society, right? As adults, we don't want young folks to be asking us anything because we're grown and we know. But to keep pushing that and keep asking and really probing and really getting deep about what do you want to see? What is it you're trying to account for? What is it you're trying to change? And I don't think you can do that if you are allowing people to shut you up or tell you that's not what you think it is. And I think that is probably for me the most important thing. I also think that, we always say this, make sure you know your history and know it well, because that is going to help you. And for a generational aspect of this, and only because we're doing this work, history really has folks do things during their moments in time that may not be appreciated 25 or 30 years later. And you need to understand that. Not necessarily accept it, but you can understand that. When we look back on this time, 20 or 30 years from now, when Gen Z or grandparents and the new generation is looking back wondering, well, why did you do that? That don't make any sense. That we need to make sure that we have a full understanding of what folks are going through at those moments in time and take it for that, and then to learn from that. But I would say for the Gen Z folks, you keep asking the questions. There is no one who can push you aside and say it doesn't make sense. There's a reason. And I always say, if you get a reaction, you're on the right spot. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, definitely, if you get a reaction, right, you're on the right spot, right? If you're being double and triple teamed, you're going the right direction and somebody's worried about what's going on, right? So, but I often think about what would I tell my 17-year-old self. Now, remember, this is now almost 40 years ago that you would be talking to that 17-year-old self. But you know what? Listen to that inner voice. Like we allow people, we allow society, we allow perceptions to devalue us. You know, we're the ones, I mean, that inner voice that says, just almost like Tracy was saying, to ask the question that says you are valued, you are worth something, you are intelligent, you are smart, you know, that so that society doesn't create this imposter syndrome for you. That I know a lot of young folks have, because a lot of us have it, that they've told us that we're not good enough, we're not fast enough, we're not smart enough, we're not bright enough, we're not thoughtful enough. So that, and we find ourselves right now in, you know, your 40s and 50s, saying to yourself, you know, who could I have been if society had not tried to define me when I was 17, right? Who could I have been? What could this world look like if we had not tried to squelch the voices of young people early and tell them what they can't do? So for me, it would be just listen to yourself and shut out, you know, someone gave me a pair of sunglasses that say hater blocker on them. Shut out all of that ugly noise that will, you know, that you start to listen to so early in life, so that you don't ask those thoughtful questions. You don't challenge individuals, you don't challenge systems. And between those things, I can't imagine what the next generation would look like if we empower them to be the best versions of themselves.
So speaking of that, y'all gave some gems. I love it. But I'm going to put you, someone is asking those questions. And so Elena R asked, and this is specific to Charlottesville. Elena says, there's been a lot of gun violence incidents in Seville, as she puts it, lately. So what are you doing about that? And how are you protecting the UVA students on and off the grounds?
So the question is actually pretty interesting in so many different ways. And it talks about the complexity of our society, right? So when we're talking about gun violence on campus or off campus, one, it's interesting is, what about the community in which UVA sits in, right? The gun violence is typically occurring in our Black and Brown communities, in which UVA is often isolated from based on their position and privilege and being able to go to those educational spaces. So although we're using some of the very traditional approaches to gun violence in the communities, what we're doing really differently is understanding the root causes of violence, right? Typically, there are a lot of root causes around violence, around economies. When people don't have access to mainstream economies, they will create an economy. When people don't have access to mainstream, you know, systems of law and order and justice, they will create their own systems of law, order, and justice, right? So what we're identifying is working with very intentional people in the communities who can help us understand where those next predictors of violence may be based on who's being harmed and who might harm someone next, right? It's a traditional model that actually came out of John Jay years ago about that. And it's also based on a trauma-informed model that came out of Milwaukee, that when people are being overly introduced or overly traumatized, there's secondary trauma, there's all these other things. The way you disrupt that is find out the root causes and identify those individuals. And then what are those systems that you can wrap around in a way that off-ramps those type of responses that are a violent response. Now, someone's going to then say, oh, you're then condoning violence, right? You're condoning shootings and things like that. No, what we're doing is we're addressing violence through some of the traditional ways of more presence, identifying violent offenders, but also using other systems so that we can disrupt violence before it's actually occurring.
So that leads me to think about Tracy and the work that CPE does when we're talking about alternative models and redesigning, reimagining public safety. How do you foresee that elevation? So let's say CPD gets this data gap analysis, they get their report. when you're thinking about the wraparound services and the long-term effects of how we provide equitable public safety, what does that look like to you? And then how does CPE play a role in that process?
Well, it's not about what does it look like to me, it's what does it look like to the community? Because the community is centered in really leading the needs around what does it mean to be safe. The other part of this is how are we defining public safety? The traditional way of defining public safety always has law enforcement at the center of it. And most people will tell you that's not it, right? If you have housing insecurity, food insecurity, now health is a huge issue. That's not what necessarily folks would say to keep them safe. But however, there are communities that will tell you we need some kind of protection, we believe. And that really depends on generational lines. And then there are others who will say we don't need the cops at all. In fact, we think we can do this ourselves. And so the work that CPE does is really begin to unpack that. What does that look like? What does that mean? Right? How do you do this? And you still have to be able to provide some type of service, right? So you just can't let folks just go, through the hole and say, just wait for something else to come along that's hopefully a little bit better. How do we do that? And so part of the work that we do is just that, is partnering with communities and saying, okay, we want a different form of public safety. What does it look like? Help them sort of have that conversation and guide that work with other government city agencies. When we're saying we want, more mental health response, we want a culturally responsive mental health response. What does that mean? What does that look like? And how is it done? How do you access it? So it's all those things. And so it's not really what other government entities want. It's what is the community asking for? What do they need? They'll tell you. I know, Chief, you've been in these meetings where folks will tell you, I don't need that. I don't need you to come through here like that. I need this. And then it is your role to figure out, how do we get what you need? How do we get what you need? And how do we, the other stuff, then if you don't need it, then we move it on. And that means oftentimes investing in other social net areas that typically don't get invested in, especially in Black and Brown communities. That's one part. The other part, though, is really around this defining of public safety and what does it mean to be safe. And that is a conversation that is hard for a lot of folks to have because it impacts so many people. But we're usually talking about the people that are most vulnerable, the ones that are, taking the brunt of the spikes in violent crime. And so it really does mean that we have to sit down and figure out in a rapid fashion, what do we need? And I think we know the social determinants of crime. We know what these things are. We don't need to study them ad nauseum. We have all those. What we have to do is begin to take what we know and take what we learn, and we've learned, and implement that. And while we implement that, we should measure that. And we should be able to measure that, to share that with other communities across the country, to say, hey, it looks like this here, it may look different for you. And we see that with the CAHOOTS model, where we have this little Eugene, Oregon that came up with this different type of way to respond to mental health crises for their officers. All of a sudden across the country is being called something different. In Denver, it's STARS, and another place it's something else. And we know those things exist. And it really is about making sure that if there are models out there, there are alternative ways to do it. Will those work in areas that are in most need and most vulnerable? And you have to use data to help make those decisions, because it's not, if you can lay over one thing that happens in Denver, you can't lay it over somewhere else and think it's going to work the same. And so, and I think that is really what we're talking about here when we say, what are our alternatives to all of this?
So I'm going to push on that too, to get some local context, because that gives a really good picture. One of the questions that came through our Facebook Live, so we're streaming on many different platforms. I cannot keep track. So if you all have questions, they will get to me. So just put them in. For you, Chief, what are some of those challenges to redesigning public safety in Charlottesville? And this person wants to know, how do you overcome those challenges?
So for me, we just actually did a 2-day seminar saying, how do you reimagine policing? And I responded, you don't. You cannot reconfigure a system, reconstruct a system, reimagine a system, redo a system that is failing in so many levels, right? So for us, the key is going to be, what is it that we want? Like we've got to say, what problem are we attempting to solve every single time, right? And use the science and data to do it. And I'm sure the community is interested is when are we going to get this data from CPE for CPD, right? So for us, the challenges are we still are trying to figure out what that looks like here in this community. I sit on several task force, the Imagining a Just C Bill task force and a mental health task force, the Marcus Alert task force, about how do you respond to those persons who are in crises. And what we're finding out with whatever approach you have, whatever you can imagine, there's often the challenges around resources, one, and capacity. So you may have all the resources to do the work you think you need to do, but then you don't have the capacity to do the work because systems are being overwhelmed and overburdened and overtaxed. If you talk right now around the mental health profession, they are burnt out. They are, especially if they're asking for someone who's culturally competent, they just don't exist because they just don't have the capacity anymore to do the type of work. Much like we have these surges in the hospital systems where the healthcare providers are saying, we may have a resource, we just don't have capacity any longer to do the work that we want to do. So that's one of the challenges. But the biggest one is still communities working with the policing agencies to define what does that public safety and safety look like, and how do we all co-create, co-produce, and then co-own what the system and the outcomes look like, right? We always seem to leave it in one place or another, that the police own this or the community owns this. Very seldom do I hear anyone talk about how do we all co-own the outcomes of the system that we currently have.
So are you asking for folks to walk into your precinct and talk to you? How do they get connected in that way then, if you are trying to have those conversations? And are agency, is your department going out into the community and soliciting that information, or is community, I don't know if many community members want to walk into a police department, but like, how do you sort of make that happen? How are you bridging the gap within your local context? And you may not have the answer to that, but can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of creative ways that you can do it. Now, particularly right now, we're experiencing upticks in COVID. So where we might have thought we may be able to gather in spaces, we have to do things like this. So you now have this forum, you now have the way to get in touch with us. You know the work we're trying to do around data. There's those ways in which we do that. We have liaisons, community liaisons for different populations, whether it's the faith-based community, whether it's our public sector, our public housing communities, our business communities, our LGBTQ plus communities, our university communities. We have liaisons that you can, if you don't have a relationship with me, get it. I've gone on television, I've gone on news and said, hey, listen, if there's ways in which you want to do this, feel free. I've shared surveys with, different communities about what does public safety look like to you and how would you like us to be in that space, right? And that's always something we're negotiating through and balancing because every community actually responds differently. When Tracy said this is generational, some of the more seasoned communities where we're a little bit older, right? We're of that Gen X or baby boomers or some other ones, they are much more comfortable with a traditional policing presence. And then there's other communities that say, hey, we want to be able to work this out in our own community. And we only want to call the police as a last resort. Help us set up peer navigation systems or peer courts or, those kinds of opportunities to resolve disputes in our own community. And as a last resort, we enter into the criminal legal system. So I think there's some opportunities. And I think also the models that CPE offers are important. And the key is you can't assume because it works somewhere else, it's going to work here, right? Everyone's trying to get on the Eugene, Oregon cahoots model, and it may not be a model that works in your community, right? I know Frederick, Maryland just started a different model of responding to certain calls with a police officer, a counselor, and a mental health professional. That may be but there are systems you have to build up around that, right? It just cannot operate in isolation.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the questions I think that comes up a lot when I'm working with community is around the system itself. Like, how does a department function? Who works in the department? What is the process for these things? And a question that came in through our Facebook account, I'm not sure whose Facebook, it says, when you start responding to calls, how is that, can you outlay that process? How do officers complete a call for service? And if you can give a little insight into that, I dial 911 and this is what happens if you call the Charlottesville Police Department. I think people are really, things that are coming through the chat are around the response of the department to calls for service.
Thank you. So I think we need to familiarize the nation with what happens when you leverage the full force of 911 against anybody, particularly in Black and brown communities, right? There's almost always the assumption when someone dials 911 that they're talking to a police officer, right? They'll say, I called Charlottesville Police Department, I dialed 911. And actually that's not true. Most places it's some regional or collaborative approach to filtering calls in and things of that nature. So when you first leverage 911, the first thing you're going to get is a call taker who is just taking the call and just getting information. Now, remember, we then start playing the telephone game because that person gets the call and then they send something over to a dispatcher who is still often a civilian. That dispatcher then dispatches what they believe the notes they just got from the call taker represent the call that they're sending the officer on, right? And that's where we're finding a lot of breakdowns from that point to the point that there's actual dispatch. And depending on what is occurring, what services are coming at the exact same time. So it may be police services are being dispatched, fire or EMS or some other services are being dispatched. And it, again, depends on the call that's coming in. But if it's something as, depending on who's calling it, it may have different outcomes. It may be a call in which they say, check on the well-being of an individual. So then you may have protective services that are responding, as well as the police, as well as all these other systems. And then once you get dispatched, right, there's normally a process, the officers start going to that, and then that interaction occurs. And then from that point, whatever the call is, through some sort of closure of either off-ramping them to a different service, a different agency, no interactions, or if there's an introduction into the criminal legal system, or a person who's been victimized or is taking reports, and then you're then working with them through victims' witnesses. But the key, I think most people don't understand, is what happens when you first dial 911 and how much of an influence that has on the time the officer gets to your location. And I think if we can really even get that to a better place, you may even have different outcomes with a lot of these encounters. And we're seeing across the nation, you cannot discount what the officers are doing. There are a lot of about 1,000 a year officer involved shootings that result in the deaths of our citizens or those people in the community, disproportionately Black and brown. But you're finding out more and more what information was relayed through dispatch is also influencing that. And you couple that with systems of implicit bias or explicit bias, almost always there will be the likelihood that there's a negative outcome for the community is going to be higher for Black and brown communities.
So I agree with all that based upon my work, but I saw Tracy nodding. Do you want to add anything here? Because I do have sort of a dovetail question to that someone put in the chat as well.
Yeah, so no, and I don't think I need to add too much more than the fact that this whole notion around call delineation, right? This is really tied to what is the role of policing? What do you need? And we know that anywhere from 2 to 4% of the calls into police departments are true, what we call true violent crime or true crime calls, and the rest are public service needs. And so if you have this kind of balance where you've got folks going to public service call needs, and I don't really need this one, I need a different kind of service, this is what we're talking about. This is what the community's talking about. Who should be showing up when I make the call? But I think the chief's 100%. We have been acculturated to 911. We dial 911 for everything, for absolutely everything. No matter where you are in the country, everybody dials. It's the first 3 digits you learn when you're little. If you're in trouble, dial 911. And we've had those calls where that's not what's happening here. So I think there also has to be a conversation around the culture of 911 and what needs to replace it. And I think that is going to be the challenge as we all really sort of talk about not just who gets dispatched, but what is the need? Why are you calling? And I think those are sort of the areas they're going to have deeper dive and deeper conversations around.
Well, then I may not be able to answer your question, Stephen W. But Stephen says that he was really interested in the discussion that we were having around the relationship between data and the presentation of a narrative of better models of policing. And so he's curious, and I'm going to actually word it how he says, or she says. I was curious if either Dr. Kesey or Dr. Brackney have come across narratives and models and language that do a better job in reassuring Black and Brown communities of police departments' commitment to harm reduction, or is the national conversation that they're hoping to figure this out?
Great. I was reading that question.
I'm interested to see this question. Are you in the?
I don't know. I don't know where I'm at, but I was reading it, and I am so enthralled by that question because it's very interesting. So for the asker, it is not necessarily changing the language to make someone feel better about what's happening to them or what they're doing. It is really around the experience influencing the narrative, right? So it's not if I change the way I talk about certain things, it will have Black and Brown communities have more reassurance that things are going right. We've done that historically. I always say, look at how we talked about community policing. That ain't it. And so what I love about the question is there is not what we consider models that give better narratives to the outcomes. It is really the influence on community in regards to their narratives to the outcome. And so what you have to do is sort of marry those two things together. So for example, we heard a lot about, cahoots and that work, and it allowed us to talk about mental health in a very different way, a very different delivery, right? So we stopped criminalizing mental health crises. We started putting in public health. So it may be able to shift the context, but narratives sometimes can't just be created to make folks feel okay. Community is much, much smarter than that. And they see right through it. But what I love about it is when we start doing some of these things, and some of this work is still happening. That's the reason why I'm also lifting this. Some of that work is still happening. And it really isn't about more so the language first, but the outcomes first. The outcomes drive the narrative. And so it is that work that we're paying close attention to. So if you have communities, for example, I think much which the chief is sort of inlining to is if you democratize your data, if you make it so community can access it and it can run their own analysis, the narratives start to change. And that is done because we've allowed folks to have access and to lead and drive it. A lot of times community line narratives and whatever the police department's doing to a sales job, right? You're changing your language or you're shifting it, but you're really actually saying the same thing. It's just a different word, just different use, right? So we're very careful. But I think one of the things that we're really starting to see is really community generated narratives around all the work that's going on. The community is really being vocal about what they think will work and want to try. And that is what's been shifting the conversation and the culture of policing. Most law enforcement are not used to having community tell them this is not it. That's what's really at heart here, is being told how to do your job, no matter who you are, is not a good feeling. But the community has been very clear in the way that they talk about this work, that it is about safety defined differently. It is about outcomes that don't disproportionately impact Black and Brown community. So the narratives the communities have been really moving forward with is what's really driving the context of the conversations we're having today. And it's a power shift, because the other thing we're not talking about here is power. And when you have community actually creating not just the outcomes, but the outcomes influence the narrative, you inherently have a shift of power. That is the other thing that's rubbing folks, is that you are being told this is not what we pay for, no matter where I live, and we need to have this differently. And so we're hearing that conversation, we're hearing it being talked about differently, We're hearing different language being used, coming from millennials to whatever generation. That is what's creating the narrative, and that will ultimately influence whether or not those changes can impact the relationship between the community and law enforcement in the way that they are. So I hope I answered your question. If not, I'm sure we can connect. I have these conversations all the time and I love them. So we can connect, but I'll pass it over to the chief and sort of tag her in on this.
Yeah, and I know we're, and we'll wrap it up knowing that we are way beyond time, but I think what's also what is uncomfortable, just basing, or just what Doc just said is who's driving the narrative right now is really uncomfortable, because in policing, we've always fashioned the narrative to make a certain group feel comfortable or feel better or to feel safe. And we presented that narrative in a way to make them feel safe, right? When we think about it, and we've tried to make it almost agnostic in our approach, problem solving, community oriented policing, right? But we never really defined whose problem, what community that we were attempting to have these relationships with. And it almost always benefited us to have them with wealthy communities who accepted us in, who would buy the coffee for you when they saw you, who waved at you. And so we were so comfortable with that narrative of what policing should look like and what those engagements look like in those places. And again, Black and brown communities are really good at understanding the difference between your narrative, your propaganda, and now what they're calling your copaganda, right? That you're pushing these ideas out there to put yourself in a better light, only waiting for the pendulum to swing back, and the narrative to swing back to, a law and order narrative versus one in which the community is saying, this is what law, order, safety, well-being, wellness, and public safety is a component of that looks like in our communities. And you're right, we're used to presenting communities with the menu and telling them, you order off this. They're now creating their own menus and saying, we want you to serve us in this way. Your version of protect and serve is not working for us. This is what we want from your communities. And they're not only wanting it, they're demanding it. And for the first time, I think in a long time, the nation is responsive to that because the people who are saying it are now slowly moving into the majority. So their voices have economic power, political power, to put police chiefs in positions, to put mayors in positions, to elect their officials. And if you're not on board with that, they do have then the sway to move you out of those positions.
So I hear a lot of moving out of positions. I don't know how people feel about that in the department. How do they feel about that in the department that you are sort of leading when there are conversations they're hearing the national conversations, they're hearing the local conversations, they're involved in incidents that are happening around the local community, and you are sort of leading that work? How are you having those conversations within the department? And what does that look like?
So these are really difficult conversations to have, because when you have them, you first have to recognize there's a problem, reckon with the problem, reckon with your past. You then have to rectify that, right? You cannot just let it stay in a status quo state. And those are really difficult conversations, because then within your own organization and policing across the nation, you'll get well, I didn't do this. It wasn't my department. It wasn't, we didn't kill George Floyd. We didn't own slaves, right? It always becomes a way to move it away from what the current narrative is within your own department and how we all contribute. Every single department, the 18,000 departments are contributing to this narrative of how policing is. So when, you say, what are those departments that are doing it well? I think there are departments who are trying to do things differently, but they're operating in the constructs of a system that is set up for them, that they have to operate in. So it's really, it can be a challenge, and you're going to get pushback. You are going to get pushback because people it's hard to think of yourself as part of the problem, particularly in policing where we think, I mean, you hear most people, Tracy may have been asked this, why did you go into policing? And they'll say, well, I wanted to help somebody. I wanted to help the community. I wanted to do these things. But when you think that you may be in a profession that you thought you were helping that may actually be harming, it is really hard to have that conversation that what you're doing might be more harmful than it is helpful. That doesn't mean all is lost. It just means we have the opportunity. I keep saying to Charlottesville Police Department all the time, we have the opportunity to set the stage, to reconstruct the narrative of what we're doing in policing. It's going to be hard, particularly if you're one of the first agencies trying to do this. It's going to be met with resistance both nationally and locally. But if we get it right here, can you imagine how it moves concentrically out across the nation, the way you influence? If we have influencers who can decide what fashion or what face creams or what hair things we use, having those same influencers in the work that we do here, I can't imagine that kind of impact across the nation.
Well, you just took my next question. I was going to close out with a where do we go from here? So I will make it more specific. You guys, see, you've been doing this so long that you already knew what I was going to ask before I asked it. So as we come to close, I want to thank everybody for watching and being a part of it. I'm not going to put their information in the chat, but I will say that you can find us at CPE at policingequity.org on all of our socials. You know where to find Chief Brackney. And the question that I have to get a little bit granular is where do we go from here in terms of the CPE CPD relationship, if you guys can talk about that. And then also add your final thoughts as well, because we got a few minutes left and I want to be able to be respectful to dinner for folks on the East Coast.
So Tracy,
I
was going to say, how about I start and then you clean it up for us since
that
we're
is
waiting
so
for a
fun.
product from you. How's that?
Yes, that's right. That's right. Right. She's just going to bat that over here.
Yeah.
But so two things. So yes. So what's next? What's next is for us to produce the report for CPD as they begin to not just fill in the missingness of the data, but what can we tell them with the current data that we have and have that shared with community and have conversations around that and determine what types of things we can do with that data for next steps. The other piece of this too, though, is really understanding, hopefully the audience understands how difficult this work truly is. I don't think anybody says that it's easy, but when you are doing the work that the chief is doing, in addition to trying to manage and to shift and move culture, it is a lot. And you are balancing not only the internal issues around what you're trying to do, but the external questions of what are you doing, and you're not doing it fast enough. So for me, it is, for communities to continue to ask these questions and to be responsive to, as you just mentioned, if you want to get a hold of the chief and say, hey, look, we need to do these things, or I need to have you hear what I'm thinking about that happens. I think you have to hear from community, and this work has to be centered around the needs. So I'm hoping that this work continues to be centered around community. Chief, that you continue to lean on CPE for data needs, and that we expand that work as you begin to do deeper dives into spaces that are going to make some folks uncomfortable, but are needed in order for you to move the organization forward.
So yeah, and just to close it up, one, I'm just grateful that first the CPE answered the call, like July of 2018. So we've been building this relationship now for 3 years, just over 3 years, right? To one, for us to trust the work that they're going to do, but for them to trust, we're giving them all of the data, the most accurate, complete picture of everything that they know, so they can tell us our story. They can tell us our story about what we may be doing well in terms of data collection and how that translates to work we do outside these doors. But again, where are those gaps and how might we narrow those gaps? Is there some process? Is there some software? Is there some place that we know who's doing it better, that because of their expansive relationships, they can help us say, connect with this department, right? I just happen to look at Durham, North Carolina, who's doing some work around creating these systems for all of their officers. It's crime data, but it's also personnel data. And they're marrying all of this stuff together to get a better picture of how officers even interact in the community that some sort of, personnel system might not tell you in its fullest, most robust way. So for me, I'm looking forward to hearing the brutal truth about the data and information. And also too, Dominique, for our listeners, it's not stagnant. We started out with, I think it was 2016 through 2020, but then as things changed and, the Justice and George Floyd Policing Act and the stuff that came out of USC trying to collect data, they asked us for some 2021 data and said, hey, this is also something we're looking for to better expand our portfolio. What I am asking of this community is, ask the questions you want answers to. And if we don't have them personally, we'll make sure that we can connect with the experts at CPE who can help us answer those questions in a real and meaningful way. So I'm always grateful for the relationship. I'm always just grateful for my sister. When Doc shows up, I know I'm about to get a lesson as well. So as well as the rest of the community.
Keep doing you, and the best to you and your community as well. And great job, Dominique. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me be in your space, both of you amazing, talented, accomplished women doing this work. It's very tough work, and I appreciate your representation, not only for the department, for the research and community, but also for the community at large, because without representation, you don't really have a foothold to make the change that you want to see. So thank you so much for your time, everyone. And again, you know where to find Chief Brackney, and you can find Policing Equity at policingequity.org on all of our channels. So thanks again and have a good night.